We're not meeting to talk about the Epstein situation. Those are the actual words of the least believable vice president in history today in the Oval Office when his plans for a meeting at the vice president's residence tonight to talk about the Epstein situation leaked so widely, including to NBC News, that James David Vance had to deny that he was planning a meeting to talk about the Epstein situation. He didn't deny the meeting. He simply said, "We're not meeting to talk about the Epstein situation." Every meeting is about the Epstein situation. Every Trump event and every Trump meeting, Trump administration meeting, Trump White House meeting is about the Epstein situation. Everything Donald Trump and everyone in his White House is doing all day, every day now is about the Epstein situation. It's about how to extract Donald Trump from his personal history with child rapist Jeffrey Epstein, who said, quote, "I was Donald's closest friend for 10 years. That meeting in the Oval Office today where Donald Trump said he was going to impose an illegal, unconstitutional 100% tariff on computer chips was about the Epstein situation. It was about distracting attention from the Epstein situation. And it worked with almost all the White House reporters in the room who were allowed to ask questions. 33 questions were allowed from the White House press corps in that room, and exactly 4 of them were about the Epstein situation. Actually, 2 questions, each with a follow-up, which is really 2 questions about the Trump situation, because there is no Epstein situation. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. And as long as Donald Trump is alive, Donald Trump should face questions and suspicions about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And the White House press corps should unite in its pursuit of answers to those questions. But the current White House press corps has no idea how to do that. The current White House press corps is mostly lost. And so each time Donald Trump was asked about Jeffrey Epstein today, the next reporter asking a question immediately changed the subject, which is exactly what Donald Trump wanted that reporter to do, exactly what Donald Trump is counting on from those reporters. We have never had a more reliably weak White House press corps when presenting questions to a president of the United States. Catherine Lucy of Bloomberg asked a good question about Jeffrey Epstein with a quick follow-up. And Nancy Cortez of CBS asked a quick question, asked a question about Ghislaine Maxwell, a good question, meeting with Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer with a quick follow-up. And not another reporter in the room asked a question about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell or Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer meeting with Ghislaine Maxwell or Ghislaine Maxwell being switched to a low security prison, which she was not qualified to be transferred to, and which is now involving extra expense for taxpayers because the security at that prison had to be enhanced simply because that one sex criminal has arrived at that prison. The only sex criminal ever to be assigned to that low security prison. Robert Hood, a former Bureau of Prisons chief of internal affairs, told NBC News in an email that, quote, "Maxwell's transfer to the camp in Bryan is a travesty of justice. To relocate a sex offender serving 20 years to a country club setting is offensive to victims and others serving similar crimes," wrote Hood. 28 questions by the White House press corps today were not about that, had nothing to do with that. And not one of those 28 questions got an answer from Donald Trump that illuminated anything. Not one of the 28 questions got an answer from Donald Trump that was real in any sense. Every one of those 28 questions got a flow of nonsensical gibberish from Donald Trump that included lies. And so the White House press corps is failing before our eyes. Every chance they get to question Donald Trump, every time they fail to pursue the only president in history who had a best friend for 10 years who was raping children nearly every day of those 10 years. Donald Trump's own Justice Department, which he now owns and operates, has said that Jeffrey Epstein raped over 1,000 victims. 1,000. More than 1,000. They don't know how many. They don't know how many thousands of children Jeffrey Epstein may have raped. And most of the White House press corps does not care. Nothing can make them care. Most of the White House press corps has no idea what any of those victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell have said under oath about what happened to them. We are watching the worst president in history manipulate the worst White House press corps in history every day. But not Catherine Lacey and not Nancy Cortez, not today. It was Catherine Lucy of Bloomberg who got Donald Trump to lie about the J.D. Vance meeting, about the Epstein situation.
Is President Vance hosting a gathering this evening to talk about how to respond to the Epstein situation?
Is he working on what?
Is he hosting some kind of gathering of top advisors this evening to talk about how to respond to the Epstein situation?
I don't know. I could ask you that question.
Donald Trump knows. That was Donald Trump lying. Everyone in that room knows that Donald Trump was lying when he said he doesn't know if his vice president was having a meeting about him. The other reporters in that room did not care that Donald Trump just lied to their faces and laughed at them, saying, I don't know, I could ask you that question. These are the same White House reporters, many of them, who screamed at Joe Biden in unison about the same subject when they believed their job was to attack him. And when they teamed up to attack Joe Biden's White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, they conducted coordinated, screaming attacks on her. And Donald Trump stands there and lies to their faces, insults them, and laughs at them, and they accept it. Here's the rest of what Donald Trump said in response to Catherine Lucy of Bloomberg.
I don't know. I could ask you that question. I don't know of it, but I think here's the man right here.
I saw it reported today, and it's completely fake news. We're not meeting to talk about the Epstein situation, and I think the reporter who reported it needs to get better sources.
Look, the whole thing is a hoax. It's put out by the Democrats because we've had the most successful 6 months in the history of our country, and that's just a way of trying to divert attention to something that's total bullshit, okay?
They're used to it now. They are completely beaten down. The White House press corps hears the President of the United States in the Oval Office use profanity, and they have absolutely no reaction to it whatsoever. The first president in history to do that. And he now does it repeatedly, especially about this subject. The Epstein situation, which is really the Trump situation, is what pushes Donald Trump to use that word and use it repeatedly. Donald Trump brings his deviancy into the Oval Office and flashes it for all to see and hear, his vulgarity, his profanity. Most of us use profanity, but most of us know when it's inappropriate. We don't use words like that in church. We don't use words like that with children. We don't use words like that here on this program. And children have been listening admiringly to presidents of the United States since the invention of radio. And children have only heard one president in history descend into the puddle of profanity that Donald Trump routinely uses. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to use the phrase defining deviancy down to describe what Donald Trump has done to presidential conduct and presidential language. Donald Trump has defined the deviancy down to his personal deviancy, and the entire Republican Party supporting Donald Trump has succumbed to Donald Trump's deviancy. His deviancy includes repeatedly giving his best wishes to sex criminal child rapist Ghislaine Maxwell. He said, I wish her well, when he was asked about her while she was in jail awaiting trial, a trial where she was convicted. Donald Trump was a friend of Ghislaine Maxwell, and apparently he's behaving as if he still is. And now every meeting at the White House is about how to get Donald Trump out of the photograph that we have of Donald Trump right here with Ghislaine Maxwell, taken in the year 2000, when she was Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend, when she was Jeffrey Epstein's criminal co-conspirator in raping children, when she personally was participating in the rape of children with Jeffrey Epstein. That's Donald Trump, sitting beside her in what we know was the prime of her criminal conduct and raping of children. Donald Trump has always boasted about the best people. He knows the best people. He says he hires the best people. He says he's especially perceptive about people. And there he is, sitting beside a sex criminal, and now insisting that he had no idea. He had no idea what kind of person she was. And today, insisting that he has no idea what his vice president is doing about him. Donald Trump chose his vice president knowing that the vice president has the power to invoke the 25th Amendment, along with a majority of the cabinet, against Donald Trump, to remove Donald Trump from the powers of the presidency. And so one of the requirements about being Donald Trump's vice president is that you must never have a meeting about Donald Trump that Donald Trump doesn't know about. And so Donald Trump told his idiotic lie today, saying, I don't know. Is the vice president having a meeting about you? Answer, I don't know. Nancy Cortez of CBS News asked about Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer, who is now the Deputy Attorney General, meeting with Donald Trump's old friend in that photograph, Ghislaine Maxwell.
Have you been briefed on what Ghislaine Maxwell told Todd Blanche?
No, I haven't.
You don't know whether you came up in the conversation?
I know Todd is a very respected person all over the country, all over the world legally, so I don't know.
I don't know. That's a lie. Donald Trump was briefed by Todd Blanche and by his attorney general about how many times Donald Trump's name appears in the Epstein files, that they searched specifically for his name. They put thousands of FBI agents on the case, studying the Epstein files, looking for Donald Trump's name. And then they went to the Oval Office, that same room where Donald Trump lied today, to brief Donald Trump on that. And only after that was Todd Blanche sent to Florida to speak to a convicted federal prisoner who has never spoken to a federal investigator before and never testified at her criminal trial and never denied raping children at her sentencing hearing when she did speak, pleading for a light sentence. Nancy Cortez wisely asked, so you don't know whether you came up in the conversation? And Donald Trump said, I don't know. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer, who has never been replaced as Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer and presumably would immediately revert to Donald Trump's personal criminal defense lawyer as soon as Donald Trump needs one again, went to speak with Ghislaine Maxwell. And Donald Trump is claiming today that he doesn't know whether his personal criminal defense lawyer asked Ghislaine Maxwell about him, or if Ghislaine Maxwell said anything about him. Some press reports already indicate, naming sources who are aware of what was discussed, that Ghislaine Maxwell said nothing that could be harmful to Donald Trump. That's already public information, and it is obvious information. It is the only reason for Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer to go to talk to Ghislaine Maxwell. His mission there was to try to extricate Donald Trump from his own personal history of friendships with two sex criminals, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. The family of one of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein's victims issued a statement about the vice president's meeting. Virginia Giuffre was found by Ghislaine Maxwell in Donald Trump's spa in Mar-a-Lago, in Florida. She was working there in high school. As soon as Ghislaine Maxwell saw her, she began planning to drag that high school student into the hell that awaited her at Jeffrey Epstein's house, and she did just that. Virginia Giuffre spoke of the years and years of nightmares and distrust that she suffered after what Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein did to her. Virginia Giuffre never found her balance again and took her own life just 4 months ago. Today, her family issued this statement. We understand that Vice President J.D. Vance will hold a strategy session this evening at his residence with administration officials. Missing from this group is, of course, any survivor of the vicious crimes of convicted perjurer and sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Their voices must be heard above all. We reiterate that Ghislaine Maxwell should have remained in a maximum security prison and does not deserve the luxuries currently afforded her. The White House reporters who changed the subject for Donald Trump both times, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, came up in the questioning today, could have asked a question about that statement by Virginia Giuffre's family. Why aren't the voices of the victims being heard at J.D. Vance's meeting about the Epstein situation? That would have been a good follow-up question to the two good questions that were asked today. But the rest of the White House reporters wasted their opportunities to question Donald Trump exactly as he expected them to do. Donald Trump said the magic word today about the Epstein situation. He said it's a hoax. That's the magic word that Donald Trump has been using for years, since it was exposed that Russia was helping the Trump campaign in 2016. And that is what Russia did. That is what Vladimir Putin did. They worked on one side of the presidential campaign to help one candidate and hurt the other. And that is what the Mueller investigation found and proved. And Donald Trump has been calling that a hoax ever since. And that has always been proven true. That is really what happened, but he calls it a hoax. And Donald Trump calling it a hoax worked. It worked with most of his followers. Donald Trump believes the word hoax is like a drug that he can administer to his followers so that they will then swallow anything else that he says after that word hoax. And it hasn't worked yet with every Republican member of the House of Representatives when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Some of them still want to know what's in the Epstein files. And some of them will get repeated opportunities to make that clear in votes in the House of Representatives. Our first guest tonight has just introduced a resolution in the House of Representatives opposing a Trump pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell or a Trump reduction in sentence for Ghislaine Maxwell. The resolution, quote, affirms that Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction and sentencing were more than warranted by the facts, and any receipt of a pardon, commutation, or other form of clemency by Ghislaine Maxwell would deny survivors the justice they deserve and formally opposes the granting of a pardon, commutation, or other form of clemency to Ghislaine Maxwell.